everybody, FIDE Master Dennis Monokroussos here, and today we're going to take a look at a game played between a pair of prodigies. White, and the winner in this game is Paramarjan, I'm not sure how to pronounce it, Nagy from India. Black is Anish Giri, who is already an extremely well-known player, lives in the Netherlands, although his ancestry, I think, is at least partially Nepali, and he lived in Russia, and anyway, he's lived in the Netherlands for several years now at least, and is extremely strong, very talented, already also a pretty good chess writer too. His rating is over 2,700. I believe he's the youngest player ever to have achieved that lofty performance, or that lofty level, I should say. But in this game, he comes out second best to Nagy, who is of course also a fantastic talent, though only, quote-unquote, in the 2600s. Alright, well, let's go ahead and start. So Giri tried the French, and it's a winnower, and now Nagy played knight g to e2, this old sideline used by Ilyakin and others. It's an interesting way to play. I mean, you know, the thing with the French, I mean, when you're white, there are all kinds of choices that are available, and sometimes you might like some aspects of the choice but not others. So, for instance, there are people who play knight to d2, and maybe they like to see c5, or they like to see knight g to f6, but they don't like the alternative, or they don't like bishop to e7, or knight c6. So, I mean, there are always these trade-offs, and here, for instance, white might like to face d takes e4 and like to face knight f6, but may not be as fond of bishop to b4. So, you know, when that arises, sometimes you can choose to go mainline in, let's say, most of the variations, but again, some of them you might prefer sideline just because you prefer certain kinds of structures, or because you don't want to commit as much time to studying the theory of one particular branch of a given opening. So perhaps that's what motivated Nagy to choose knight g to e2. It's not considered to be the most testing move, certainly. I mean, that is certainly e5. I mean, I don't think there's really a great deal of dispute about this in the chess world as a whole, but knight g to e2 is certainly playable, and at the very least it gives you the chance to save, at least every so often, on studying a lot of theory. Now, black almost always plays d takes e4 here, but knight c6 can actually be played, and knight f6 is not a bad idea either. And here, white can either play e5 or bishop to g5, but I would say that this is not quite as promising in either case as the corresponding position is with black's bishop back on f8 and the knight back on g1. So it's playable, but knight f6 is not a bad choice for black. Okay, so Giri played d takes e4, which is the main move. Nagy played a3, and here this offers a mild temptation to black to try to hold on to the pawn. But Giri, I think rightly, just disregards this and plays bishop to e7. But we can discuss bishop takes c3 a bit. We might as well while we're here. So knight takes c3, and now, again, black has a choice. So you can play knight to c6 or f5. And f5 I would certainly recommend against. This is the move that was chosen by Nimzovich in a very famous game played against Ilyakin in Bled in 1931. And speaking of Bled, that's what Nimzovich did in this game. He got crushed pretty handily. Ilyakin played kind of the quasi-Blackmar-Dimar Gambitish f3, and after takes, and takes, well, actually before we get to queen takes, as played in the game, knight f6 has been played quite a bit more, and might be reasonable, although I would still prefer white in this position. Black's up a pawn, but white's got the bishop here. The dark squared bishop is very good. The e6 pawn is backward. White has more space, etc. I mean, lots of things in white's favor. So queen takes d4. I mean, you've gone this far. You've destroyed your own structure a bit. You might as well grab a second pawn and hope for the best. So Ilyakin played queen to g3, threatening to take on c7, as well as perhaps bishop to f4, followed by bishop to e5, another idea. So Nimzovich decided he better develop and hope for the best here. So Ilyakin took, queen check here, rook g8, queen h6, and queen h4. And it might not seem that terrible for black offhand. He's still up a pawn, and white hasn't really finished his development, so it's going to take him a little bit. But white's just in time. So bishop to d7, bishop g5, bishop c6, And now white castled long. And here, this is looking pretty grim. Yeah, this is not a happy position. Black isn't castling. He hasn't castled, and he's not going to achieve it. And the game ended quite quickly. Bishop takes g2, rook h to e1, threatening bishop to b5 check, picking up the queen. And after bishop e4, bishop h5. This threatens to win a bunch of material. The biggest threat right now is bishop takes f6. And black can't recapture with the queen because queen takes and the rook on g6 is pinned. So Nimzovich took, but now rook to d8 check, king f7, queen takes h5. And here we are, just 19 moves into the game, and it was already time for poor Nimzovich to resign. There are a lot of problems with this position here. Queen takes h7 is a threat. There's also the threat of knight takes e4, f takes e4, and then, for instance, rook to f8 check, followed by bishop to h6, or bishop e7, and then queen takes e5. And this is, as I said, this is just horrible. Another possibility, if black plays something like king to g7, then knight takes e4, fe4, bishop h6 check, hitting the queen, and on king f6, just rook f8. And this is obviously fatal. So, that was a quick disaster. So instead of f5, I think a better choice would be knight to c6. But white still has good play. Bishop to b5, defending the pawn on d4 indirectly. Knight g to e7, bishop g5, f6, bishop e3, castles, queen d2. And here, if black doesn't play f5, white regains the pawn and should have a nice position. So maybe f5 is, if not forced, then the most principled move here. And now white can choose between a couple of options. He could just castle queenside, which seems to be quite okay. Or he could play f3, speculating a bit, opening up the g file. And for instance, the following line has occurred in several games. And it seems to me that black should be pretty okay here. So maybe that's an argument for castling queenside. But even here, I think black is probably all right. So it's a very interesting line, very interesting position. And again, knight g to e2, like I said, it doesn't promise an advantage, but the thing about it is it's not so hard to play, and black players, I think, are certainly less familiar with it than they will be with e5. So it's not an impractical choice. Okay, so Geary chose bishop to e7. Again, kind of a calm approach. He keeps both of his bishops. He doesn't bother trying to hold on to the pawn. And this should be good enough for equality. I mean, the thing is, after knight e4, knight f6, for instance, this knight on e2 is a little bit stupid. I mean, of course, you can go to c3 or you can go to g3, but he's wasting a little time repositioning it. It would be much better if it could just go to f3. You put the knight on f3 here, and white has probably a slight edge, or at least good chances for an edge. On e2, much less. All right, here white took. Also possible, okay, I should say from here, knight c6 is also a reasonable possibility. And after knight f6, white can choose between knight 2 to g3, which is, I think, by a pretty big margin the main move. One idea is to swap on f6 and eventually play knight h5. There's also queen to d3, which aims in some cases to castle queenside. But knight f6 was played in the game. Bishop f6, bishop e3. Wants to defend the pawn so he can move the knight without any worries. It also prepares castling queenside. Okay, here black castled short, but a very common move is knight to c6, putting pressure on the d4 pawn. And the second point is that after queen to d2, again preparing to castle long, black can play e5, immediately taking his shots at the white center. And after d5, knight e7, castles, and then knight to f5, I think black is in pretty good shape here. So this is, again, a quite reasonable position. Black can grab the bishop here, more or less at his leisure. Since bishop c5, b6, bishop b4, a5, I mean, that's not going anywhere. The bishop's not great on c3. And maybe black has something even better than that, but he has at least that. Yeah, of course, bishop to g5 is maybe even a bigger threat. Although, it's not winning yet, but it's not pleasant. Anyway, knight to c6, as I said, is a line that can also be advocated. Geary chose to castle first, queen to d2, and now to play b6. And I think b5 has been played as well. And so this makes sense. It takes care of the problem of the bad French bishop. It's going on this nice long diagonal. And, okay, now white has a choice. In the game, Nagy chose to castle long. But a move that's also played is g4. Obviously aiming to get on with the kingside play as fast as possible. So bishop to b7, rook g1, knight d7, g5, bishop b7, finally castling queenside. And this occurred in a game, a very high-level game, between Gadir Gusinov and Konstantin Sakhaev back in 2005 in Warsaw. And that game ended as a draw. I'll give it a few more moves. And after knight c5, Gusinov was unable to find anything better than just swapping off here. And the game was a draw soon thereafter. Alright, so g4 is certainly interesting. It's playable. Doesn't seem to be crushing. So in our game, Nagy castled long. Giri played bishop to b7, and now a new move, knight to f4. I think rook to g1, and I think also knight to g3 had been played before too. Actually, I think there's 3 games. So one was rook to g1, one was knight to g3, one was knight to c3. And the higher rated game was with rook to g1. But okay, Nagy was considerably higher rated than any of the other players, so I would follow his lead for the moment anyway. So he played knight f4. And this does a couple of things. So it supports the d5 advance, and it prepares to bring the knight to h5. Alright, Giri plays knight to d7, which again makes sense. It gets out of the way of the bishop, or stays out of the bishop's way. Okay, d5. And here, black played e5, which may not be so bad, but a really dynamic and interesting option is knight to c5. Black is willing to allow white to really give him a pretty gruesome looking pawn structure with bishop c5 and then maybe de. But it seems that black is really doing pretty well there. Also, if you play bishop c5, then there are these perpetual bishop to g5 worries once again. So this might be worth a punt, as the British like to say. Instead, Giri played e5, which I think is still okay. But the bishop's not quite as happy now. Knight to h5, bishop b7. Here, white might consider king to b1, just standard idea to get the king off this diagonal. After g6, knight g3, knight f6, bishop h6. White picks up an exchange, but it looks like black gets good compensation. Rook to e8, I think, is not so great on account of bishop to b5. But queen takes d5 may be about equal. I mean, here you can see that black's minor pieces are all very good, and he's got a pawn for the exchange. His unchallenged dark square bishop is a nice piece, and the bishop on b7 is quite good as well. I mean, the knight can come to f4, and white will have to play f3, but even with blocking the bishop on b7, still, if the knight's on f3, it causes some discomfort to the pawn on g2. So I would say that black has fully equal chances here by way of compensation for the slight material deficit. So white decided, forget prophylaxis, go forward, f4. So here he comes. Now, black chose to play e takes f4, but he might play g6. And, okay, white could play the pedestrian knight to g3, and something like this is interesting and roughly equal, but my idea here would be to play f takes e5. And I think probably black is best served, or at least most safely served, with knight takes e5. So just disregarding the offer, thank you for the knight, but no thanks. I'll centralize my own knight instead. Maybe play knight to g4, and again, I think black is all right here. If g takes h5, on the other hand, now I like white. Bishop f4, queen e3, bishop e2, and you'll pick up the pawn on h5, and this beautiful pawn center. I mean, this really kind of throttles the black bishops quite nicely. The knight on c5 is stuck, and I like white, as I said. I'm not sure that white is objectively better yet, but I don't think he's objectively worse. And practically speaking, it's a lot easier to play white. So I would take this in a heartbeat. But as I said, I wouldn't be surprised at all, and won't be surprised if this position arises in a game subsequent to this one, and black chooses knight takes e5 here. Okay, so in the game, as I said, Giri chose e takes f4, which is a perfectly legitimate move. Bishop takes f4, and again, g6 can be played, and maybe here it should have been played. This time, I think some kind of clever piece sacrifice like bishop h6 is not quite so good. G takes h5, queen f4, hoping for queen g3 check, but After bishop to d6, there's just no easy entree to the g file for the white queen, and I think actually that black is winning at this point. So bishop h6 is no good. If bishop takes c7, all right, this doesn't really get anywhere. It's just an exchanging combination, and in this ending, black seems to be fine as well. The bishop on b7 is a fine piece, and it's roughly equal, but maybe if anyone's better, it's black by a hair. So white probably has nothing better than just to retreat to g3 and to say that, okay, I've maybe wasted a tempo with my knight, but g6 is a weakening move, so I'm not unhappy about this. So for instance, knight f6, bishop c4, protecting the pawn, and black might have a little counterplay with b5 and then a5, but after rook h to f1, probably something like rook to a6, maybe white has some chances for a pull here, but I mean it's just an interesting position. But I think the f file, excuse me, the f file is a nice asset. The white bishop can come to h6 to drive the rook from f8. Maybe there will be a pawn sack with d6. So probably white might have a little bit of an easier time here than black, but it's still, I think, roughly balanced. Okay, instead of g6 though, Geary played bishop to d6. And this makes sense. So the bishop, it's challenging white's bishop. It takes better control over the e5 square. So perhaps if the white bishop moves away, then at some point in the near future, black will play bishop e5. It's an interesting position. All right. So what should white do now? Do you trade? Do you not trade? Bishop g5, maybe g3. Maybe queen d4 could be possible, attacking g7. What should white do? Well, I'll give you a hint. Imagine that black had a pawn on h6. What would you immediately consider in that case? Of course, you'd consider bishop takes h6. When a square is unoccupied, it's a lot harder for some reason to spot the move bishop h6. It's not just the fact that you're not gaining that extra pawn, but I don't know, somehow we look at checks and captures more naturally. I mean, I think we're ingrained very early in our careers. We read instructional books, or we hear lectures, watch videos, get advice from friends, and we're told, look at checks and captures. A move like bishop to h6 is just as violent in one sense as bishop takes h6, but because there's no capture, somehow it's much more likely to escape our mind's eye. And I think, again, for many of us, we might have just completely missed this. Even the engines missed this for a while, so I had to run my engine for quite a while before it spotted and preferred this as its favorite choice. But eventually it does, and rightly so. I mean, this is a very strong move here. Now, for a while, Geary defends just perfectly, and white's only a little bit better at this point. But eventually, the tide turns. So black really has nothing better than g takes h6 at this point, and that's what he did. Queen h6, bishop e5, and now another very nice move that Nagy had to see before playing bishop to h6. I shouldn't quite say that, because I think he has other moves that maintain approximate equality, but there's only one move that maintains some advantage for white here. A move that's very, very natural and not bad, but only good enough, I think, for equality is bishop to d3. Okay, the threat is obvious, and f5 is clearly forced in response. And now white has two, I think, decent tries, but again, neither of them ultimately seems to promise an advantage, although perhaps maybe there is something there, and if you keep looking, you'll find it. So my first idea here was to play g4, trying to both open the diagonal and also, well, to do three things really. Open the diagonal, open the g file, and also maybe make this pawn on g4 when it gets to f5, or maybe in some case g5 and then g6, to turn this into an attacking unit in its own right. So king h8 is best here, I think. Bishop takes f5, threatening mate. Rook f7, rook h to e1, threatens to take on d7 and then on e5. But after bishop to f6, although white's position looks kind of promising, there doesn't really seem to be anything. And the big problem here, of course, is that bishop takes d7, which would otherwise be wonderfully attractive, is just losing on the spot to bishop g5 check. So this nasty little shot is kind of a permanent resource that white has to be aware of. So g4, I think, doesn't really prove anything. Okay, another obvious move, and I think a decent move, is rook h to f1. But again, the black king tucks itself away in the corner, and then rook f7. And here black should maybe be a little careful. I mean, it would be nice to play bishop g7 and kick the queen away. But here white has a fancy move that seems to keep some advantage. Rook to d4. So a nice way of bringing this this last piece into the attack. I mean, all of white's other pieces are perfectly poised to pressure the black king, but the rook on d1 wasn't helping. But now it enters right away. Of course, bishop takes d4 is impossible. It just gets mated. So the rook comes into play. After queen e8, knight g7, rook g7, queen c3, threatening, of course, not only queen takes c7, but rook to g4, queen e7, rook f4, threatening rook to f7, and now rook to c4. And white is clearly better here. Rook takes c7 is coming next. White will have 3 pawns for the piece and a big advantage. Very difficult for black to survive here. So instead of bishop to g7 here, probably the immediate rook to e7 is better, and only after rook f5, for instance, bishop to g7. It's a complicated position. Maybe it's about equal, but really, I mean, it's the kind of thing where 5, 6, 7 moves down the road, it might turn out that white's attack will prove irresistible. So I didn't see any clear win, neither did the engine, but maybe it's there. So it could be worth exploring. But it seems that bishop to b5, as chosen by Nagy, was the best move. So this threatens to play bishop takes d7, and then after queen takes d7, queen g5 check, and then queen takes e5. So black has to play something to take care of this, either defend the bishop or, let's say, move the king. So if rook to e8, then rook h to e1 renews the threat. Bishop h8, then takes, and bishop takes d7. Gives white a big advantage. It regains the piece, white's up a pawn. The point is that if queen takes d7, simply rook to d3 followed by rook to g3 is crushing. So black should play something like queen to e5, c3, and then bishop takes d5. And now material is even again, surprisingly enough. And black's got the bishop pair, and his queen looks nice in the center, but still, the king on g8 is not a happy camper. After bishop to a4, I think white maintains a pretty decent edge here. The bishop's going to come to c2, and if the bishop goes to e4, black's bishop that is, then white might seize the other diagonal, plus the d file is open. So white is certainly for choice here. So I think Geary played the right move with king to h8. This was good. Rook h to e1, threatening, of course, again to take on d7 and then on e5. And here, if bishop to f6, then, of course, not bishop takes d7 because of this same trick. But after king to b1, black strangely has no defense to the threat of bishop takes d7. I mean, the knight has to stay there to defend the bishop. The bishop has to stay more or less where it is to defend the mate on g7. So it all is one unhappy structure that is about to collapse next move. So once again, so bishop to f6 would be a serious mistake. Rook to g8 was played instead, and this is a very good move. It returns the piece, but it keeps the disadvantage to a minimum here. So off come the queens, and white played g4, and now black regains his pawn. Okay, white makes a good move here, without which black's position would be very, very good. But bishop to f5. So now the rook on g5 is kind of shut out of the game. White has nice control over the central files. Obviously the e file, but potentially the d file as well if he can push to d6 safely at some moment. And there's also the possibility, as we'll see in the game, of maybe generating some attacking chances here too. Now here, Geary, keep getting these two names backwards every so often. White is threatening to play rook to e7, so very naturally Geary played bishop to d6. It's the most obvious kind of move in the world, so it gets out of the way of rook h1 followed by h-file stuff. It stops rook to e7, it blockades white's pawn on d5. All very nice, but it seems to be a mistake. The best move, it appears, was bishop to c8, really kind of fighting against this powerful bishop on f5. White's best is probably rook to e8 check, but then rook to g8, and white maybe should just swap twice on c8, and he maintains a small advantage, but I think a draw would be the likeliest result then. So white can still push, but black is more or less okay. Instead, though, the very natural bishop to d6 proved to be surprisingly mistaken. Nagy played knight to f6, and alright, the threat is to just take on h7. Very simple. If black plays h6, then, okay, king to b1, getting out of the way of any of these worrisome checks that we've seen before. Say bishop f8, rook e3, rook d8, rook to c3. That's the point of king to b1. So here, of course, if rook e3, there's bishop to f4. So we get out of the way. Now the rook's going to come to c3. And this, too, proves to be a surprisingly annoying problem. If bishop to d6, then knight e4 is clearly better for white. Or if c5, then the rook switches back to e3. And now with this passed d5 pawn, black has real problems. I mean, white may continue with some plan like c4, rook d to e1, and rook to e8. And notice that this rook on g5 is just really struggling. I mean, it can't go sideways, it can't go forward. It can go to g7, but what does that do? It's a terrible square. So this is really unpleasant. Black could play bishop to g7 to kick the knight away, but then after knight h5, the rook can't jump over the bishop to go back to g8. So instead of that, Geary played rook to g7, choosing to defend the h-pawn a different way. White played rook to h1, very natural. And here, black probably had to try bishop to f4 check and then h6. But this involves an exchange sack, so that's not terribly appealing either. Knight h5. So the bishop goes to g5, white grabs the exchange, but it is a very good dark squared bishop, and it does a fine job of blockading. So black still has some chances, very slim, but some chances to hold the game. After bishop to e5, knight takes h7, however, it's not so much the pawn that's the problem, but just how bad black's king still is. Even with queens off the board, it's still a big problem. Okay, white threatened knight to f6 check, so king g8 was forced. Rook d to e1. And now, well, what in the world does black do? I mean, the threat, and the problem for black here, is that he plays something like bishop to d6, then knight f6 check, king f8, and rook h8 with mate next move. Okay, if he tries bishop to f4 check, king d1, rook h7, well, it's just an exchange again. And alright, this seems to be an even slightly better version than what I was suggesting earlier. I mean, this time white won the h-pawn. The other example, black kept the h-pawn. So now white will retreat the bishop to f5, and black has to worry about the rook penetrating to the 7th rank, not only on the e-file, but the h-file also. So from here, Geary just played bishop takes d5. Okay, still doesn't look that bad. If, I mean, the rook on h1 is hanging, so there's no rook takes e5 here. Alright, so rook to h5 was played, f6, and now it looks like black might be out of trouble. There's no knight to g5, there's no knight takes f6, the e-file is plugged up. It's almost happy days here for black. So what can white do? Well, if it weren't for this, black would be great, but there is this. Rook takes e5, and then knight f6, and knight takes d5. So a simple combination, and as is usually the case, two pieces are worth far more than a rook. Generally speaking, I would prefer the two minor pieces to even a rook and a pawn, but with no pawn, forget it. This is just the end of the game. So a few more moves, and then it's over. c6, knight b4, c5, knight c6. So not even worrying that this knight's going to get stranded here. After king f6, rook h6 check, king g5, and rook to e6. The e5 pawn drops, and then white has the two minor pieces and a pawn for the rook. So that's hopeless, and Geary understandably resigned here. So a very nice game by the young Indian, by Nagy. Also, hopefully, this will be an interesting line for some of you who, again, aren't happy in facing the French. So I've shown you guys quite a few lines over the years on how to meet the French. Of course, there's no magic silver bullet to just kill this thing dead once and for all. And, that's a good thing. I mean, the more variety in chess, the better it is. So, a lot of openings when you watch these Super GM tournaments seem to be drying up. So the French happily is one that doesn't dry up, and makes life fun. So, part of the fun too with the French is that there are so many different ways that white can face it as well. Okay, well, I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you can learn something from this game that you can use in your own chess, and I'll see you next time. Take care. Bye-bye.